My name is Ali Bedad, and I'm the director of the Center for Near Eastern Studies. And on behalf of my colleagues, I would like to welcome you to this talk, to the second Averroës lecture of this series, which we have been doing for several years now. Before I turn the podium to my colleague Omar Boum, who will introduce our today's speaker, Professor Marina Rustow, I would like to take just this opportunity to thank several colleagues, first and foremost Sarah Stein and the Levy Center for Jewish Studies for the co-sponsorship of these series. As well, I would like to thank my colleagues at CNN, especially Omar, I think Susan Slimovich, who have really taken on sort of the intellectual leadership with Sarah Stein to help us organize these series. I also should give a shout out to our stellar staff, especially Christian Rodriguez, who's here tonight to help us out. For those of you who are not familiar with the Center for Near Eastern Studies, I think many of you are, CNES is a research center where over 100 faculty from humanities, social sciences, arts, and law school collaborate in a variety of research and pedagogical projects. It's a center that was founded in 1957 and is one of the oldest center for interdisciplinary research on the broader Middle East. We provide a forum for exchange of ideas and dissemination of information within and beyond campus. And our colleagues do really cutting-edge research and offer our faculty and the broader community fresh perspectives on the challenges and cultural richness of the region. We also support graduate and undergraduate fellowships and awards of various sorts to students who work on the Middle East. As you know, we get support from the Department of Education and the Mellon Foundation recently. Today's talk is part of the Averroës Lecture Series that has been underwritten by a generous anonymous donor, and which focuses on the Jewish communities living in the Muslim world prior to the 20th century. We have named the series Averroës, the Latin name for Ibn Rushd, as those of you who are familiar with the history of the medieval Islam, the 12th century Andalusian polymath, whose philosophical work really integrated Islamic traditions with ancient Greek thought, to point out the history of Cordoba's Jewish-Muslim relations as a model of coexistence and the connections between Averroës as an intellectual and the Jewish philosopher Maimonides, both of whom were committed to intellectual exchange and communal life across religious boundaries. I would like to very briefly introduce our wonderful colleague Omar, who is a sociocultural anthropologist here at UCLA and now also the program director for our Mellon Grant on minorities in the Middle East, which we hope to do more of this kind of a program, but also other minorities as well. Omar Steller's ethnographic work addresses the place of religious and ethnic minorities in MENA region. He has published widely on this topic. His publication includes an important book, Memories of Absence, How Muslims Remember Jews in Morocco, which was published by Stanford University Press, a very important book that I highly recommend, and recently co-edited with Sarah Stein, The Holocaust and North Africa, which was published by Stanford University Press. So Omar, please introduce our speaker and welcome to the podium.
Welcome everyone. It takes a special and unique scholar to revisit the Ben Ezra Cairo Geniza after a generation of scholars such as Goitein, Mark Cohen, and others have done so and still see what they couldn't. It takes a scholar with special linguistic gifts, knowledge of materiality and paper, scholarly investigative expertise, and ability to reconstruct puzzles out of paper fragments. Above all, it takes a scholar with the sense of humility to collaborate with others to put together a story out of paper dispersed in different archives and institutions. Dr. Marina Rustow has proven without doubt to be up to the challenge and emerged as a leading 21st century expert of the Cairo Geniza. A historian of Judeo-Arabic documents of the Cairo Geniza and the history of Jews during the Fatimid period, Dr. Rustow is the Khedouri A. Zilkha Professor of Jewish Civilization in the Near East at Princeton University. In 2014, she was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, followed by a MacArthur Fellow in 2015. Professor Marina Rustow received a BA from Yale University and 2 masters and a PhD from Columbia University under the mentorship of Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi. She taught at Emory University from 2003 until 2010 and Johns Hopkins University from 2010 to 2015, prior to joining the faculty of Princeton University, where she is currently professor in the Department of Near Eastern Studies and History and director of the Princeton Geniza Lab. Professor Rustow has changed our understanding of the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia state which ruled in North Africa between 10th and 12th centuries. As a historian whose research is largely based on the Geniza, Dr. Rustow has managed and succeeded to shed new light on eternal Jewish life and on broader Fatimid society of the medieval period. Dr. Rustow's approach to this archive goes beyond decoding documents, in itself a formidable task, to questioning the relationship between subject and medieval state and asking what that relationship tells us about power and the negotiation of religious boundaries. In Heresy, talking about her first book, in Heresy and Politics of Community, the Jews of the Fatimid period, the Jews of the Fatimid Caliphate, Dr. Rustow focuses on the period from 909 to 1171 CE and upends long accepted ideas about the relationship between 2 rival Jewish communities under the Fatimid rule. Analyzing archival documents and material from the point of view of both the Islamic and Jewish communities, Professor Rustow has built an academic career through mining these documents of what they can tell us about how the Caliphal state ruled and how Jewish, Christian, and Muslim subjects related to it. Her second book, which is going to be on sale after the talk, The Lost Archive, Traces of a Caliphate in Cairo Synagogue, is a new book published by Princeton University Press in 2020, and analyzes the Fatimid history of documentation through material found in the Fustat Synagogue. Reminiscent of work about Islamic writing and manuscripts in sub-Saharan Africa, Rustow challenges that argument that Islamic dynasties produced little documents and manuscripts. With patience, rigor, and excellent analysis, Dr. Rustow takes her readers from the Geniza Trove to communal spaces and outside geographic borders of Egypt, following the complex routes by which Arabic documents made their way from Fatimid palace officials to Jewish scribes. Just like what she did in her first book on heresy and the politics of community, Dr. Rustow invites us again to rethink Fatimid archives through the lens of what she calls pre-industrial ecology of documentation. Deploying her considerable prowess in languages, social history, and paper, Dr. Rustow is rewriting our understanding of medieval Jewish life and transforming the historical study of the Fatimid Empire. Please join me in welcoming our winter Averroës lecture speaker, Dr. Marina Rustow.
Omar, thank you so much for that really generous introduction. That was really nice of you. And thank you to Ali and to the Center for Near Eastern Studies, and especially to Christian Rodriguez for making this visit possible, and as well as colleagues and administrators in the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, especially Jessica Goldberg and Luke Yarborough, who organized a conference that's happening this weekend that was the initial impetus for my trip to LA. I'm going to move a little bit closer in the hope that proximity will make up for the lack of a microphone, and also the fact that I'm going to lose my voice over the course of this lecture because I'm getting over a cold. And thank you all very much for being here. I live in New York, and I came to LA via Chicago, and with weather like this, I wouldn't be sitting in a room indoors, so I appreciate it. So pre-modern historians all face a similar problem, which is lack of information. And the consequences of this lack of information they're slightly different when you look at it from the perspective of Jewish history and the perspective of Middle Eastern history. So from the Jewish side first, when the Muslims conquered the region that we now know as the Middle East in the 7th and 8th centuries, most Jews were living in areas that came under Muslim rule within the first decades of conquest. We know actually very little about what happened next. We do know that Talmudic law, so basically what formed the basis of Jewish law, is largely agrarian. Meaning if you read the Babylonian and the Palestinian Talmuds, the version of Jewish law that you're going to see represented presumes that most Jews are living in rural communities. Yet we also know that if you flash forward 500 years later, the Judaism that emerged is 100% urban. So what happened in between? A subsidiary question to that is, how did the rabbinic construction of Judaism win out over all the other possible constructions? Judaism never developed a papacy or church councils or a grand mufti or other centralized structures of governance. And instead it relied on a kaleidoscopically shifting network and nodes of rabbis whose opinions Jews were actually under no obligation to follow. So given that the rabbis were relying entirely on persuasion and had very little coercive power, how did they convince anyone to actually listen to them? So that's like just a glimpse of the kinds of questions that hover over the first 500 years of Islamic rule from the Jewish history side. On the Middle East side, the questions are broader, but I think no less perplexing. There's a widespread perception to which Omar just referred that the Middle East used documents less than Europe did in the Middle Ages. So the kind of most succinct and strongest statement of this thesis, I'm just going to bring you, there are many places from which I could bring this, but I'm going to bring it from a book that was published in the 90s, an otherwise excellent book on medieval Damascus by Michael Chamberlain, where he argues that in the Middle East, rulers maintained patrimonial, if not absolutist, claims, considered most of the wealth of their subjects their own, and permitted other social bodies none of the formal autonomies they had in Europe. Individuals, households, religious bodies, and groups did not brandish documents as proofs of hereditary status, privilege, or property to the extent that they did in the Latin West. Nor were their strategies of social reproduction recorded, sanctified, or fought out through documents to the extent they were in Europe. So you can see that the comparison between the medieval Middle East and medieval Europe is right there in the minds, even of specialists in medieval Middle East history. The idea is that the grass is much greener on their side of the Mediterranean, and they have better archives to work with. In fact, this is a total myth actually on both sides. If you look at the period before 1200, in fact, the Middle East has preserved far more original documents than medieval Europe has, largely because the medieval European documents were at a certain point jettisoned, especially over the course of the 9th and 10th century, and copied into what are known as cartularies, which are kind of summaries and registers of documents. So we have lots of kind of documentary content, but we don't actually have a lot of original documents from Europe before 1200, whereas we have nobody's actually counted, but certainly hundreds of thousands of documents from the Middle East. So this myth has had consequences for the field. Some of the other assumption that you see embedded in the Chamberlain quotation is the idea that together with documents goes a certain presumption about rights and privileges. So you can't defend rights and privileges unless you have access to documentation and document production. And so what Chamberlain is saying here is there were no documents, and effectively what you had was rulers making arbitrary decisions. So all of this has had unfortunate consequences for the field of medieval Middle Eastern history, because people tend not to look for the documents that exist. Documents are important to historians, especially because they give us access to information that was not intended for long posterity. But even more than long posterity, one of the many things that interest me about documents is how they're used in kind of the immediate play of social power. In fact, we have vast caches of documents, many of them from Egypt, but it's not just Egypt. The proximity, in general, the proximity of the desert and the Saône is conducive to the preservation of human artifacts. So the clearest example of this actually is a cache of mostly ancient papyri from a town that in the Roman period in Egypt was called Oxyrhynchus, now known as Abechnasa, where as the town contracted over the course of the late Roman period, the houses kind of hewed to the banks of the Nile, leaving a gigantic trash heap out in the desert where 500,000 documents were preserved, most of them in Greek, although there are some Arabic documents from Oxyrhynchus as well, which have not been published. So if you tally up all of the papyrus, paper, and parchment documents from the Middle East before 1200, there are far more than there are from medieval Europe, let alone from Byzantium. So in what follows, I'm going to try to give you a kind of Janus-faced view of what all of this documentation has the potential to do to our image of both Jews in the Islamic world and of the Middle East more broadly. At the time of the Islamic conquest, the two largest Jewish communities in the world were to be found in Mesopotamia and Syria, with other important communities in Asia Minor and Egypt. So the most significant thing that this map demonstrates for my purposes, you can see that in the darker green you have the conquests, Muslim conquests up until 632. In the middle shade of green, 632 to 661, and then finally in the lightest shade of green, the conquest that happened between 61 and 750. So there's a kind of concentric circle geographically going on here. So the biggest Jewish communities were in Mesopotamia and Syria, with other communities in Asia Minor and in Egypt. And what that means is that most Jews in the world lived in regions that the invading Muslim armies would conquer in their very first decade of campaigning outside the Arabian Peninsula. So Palestine fell between 636 and 640, Egypt in 640, Iraq in 642, which means that before the last Sasanian Shah was killed, before the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius knew that he'd permanently lost the Eastern Mediterranean, most of the world's Jews were living under a single polity, and they would continue to do so for half a millennium or more. So basically they started out here, and then the Jewish populations spread from there, but I'll get to that in a minute. The notion that the Islamic conquest proceeded in an Islam or the sword fashion has been debunked already for a long time, although the consequences of that still have yet to be fully spelled out. In a fascinating example of a book whose methods have been basically completely, questioned to the point of being, nobody really accepts the methodology anymore, and yet at the same time, everyone accepts the general conclusions. I'm talking about Richard Bullitt's book, Conversion to Islam in the Medieval Period, which was a fascinating attempt in 1979 to apply the methods of quantitative history to the medieval Islamic period. And methods aside, what Bullitt tried to do was to shed light on the gradualness of conversion to Islam and some of the consequences that that might actually have, and some of also the causes, and how that linked up with some of the events that we knew best from Islamic history, like the consolidation of empire and then the fragmentation of empire. So what Bullitt concludes is that the proportion of Muslims in the Middle East didn't reach an absolute majority until the 9th or 10th century, depending on the region. So that means that Muslims were ruling over a vast majority of non-Muslims for the first 300, 400 years of their rule. Linguistic Arabization was also a gradual process and a separate but not completely unrelated one. And even the language of empire and its administrative practices were slow to change. You can see this in some of the documents that have survived. So these are two bilingual Greek-Arabic papyri, one from Egypt and the other from Syria. And the Arabic text is on the top and the Greek text is on the bottom. Fascinatingly, both of them concern taxation, and in neither case does the Greek and the Arabic text say precisely the same thing. So this is kind of an example of, if you're conquering a big swath of the planet and you still want to collect taxes, you should keep the tax structure in place and have the people who are collecting taxes under the Romans continue to collect taxes under your rule. But at the same time, your view of all of this from the upper echelons of the administration, i.e. the people writing in Arabic, is going to be slightly different from the view of the people on the ground. So nothing necessarily I'm not claiming that nothing changed at the first conquests. At the same time, it would be, I think, a stretch to argue that everything changed at the first conquest for Jews or for anyone else. So despite these papyri and other smaller but equally mind-blowing cache of early Islamic documents, which are still in the process of being published and interpreted, what follows the Islamic conquest in Jewish history is a vast blackout of substantive information nearly everywhere except for Iraq and Syria. And even there, all we know are the works of a thin crust of the literate elite in and around the rabbinic academies at Tiberias in Palestine and Sura and Pumbedita on the lower Euphrates in Iraq. So basically, there's a vast silence until about 900. That silence lifts, and when it lifts, not only were there dense and well-organized Jewish communities all over the vast expanse of the Islamicate world, but those communities were already urban and prosperous to an astonishing degree. The scattered bits of information that we do have suggest that the Jews adopted Arabic earlier than Christians, likely because they were faster to move to cities. So cities are really the big kind of story here. A conservative estimate puts 9th century Baghdad at 500,000 inhabitants. For comparison's sake, remember that after Imperial Rome, no city in Europe would reach 500,000 inhabitants until 17th century Paris and London. So 500,000 is very, very impressive for a pre-modern city. A less conservative figure estimates Baghdad at closer to 1 million inhabitants, which would make its only medieval rival 8th century Chang'an, which was about to be destroyed anyway. So even rabbinic scholasticism was forced in the end to become urbane, urban, and sophisticated. So the yeshivas, the rabbinic academies in Iraq, which had always existed in these kind of rural communities, themselves moved to Baghdad by 900. The Gaonim who ran these academies in the 10th and 11th century were cosmopolitan, educated broadly in the sciences and not just in rabbinic law, educated in canonical Jewish texts and methods, but also in Islamic jurisprudence and philosophy. And an example that I like to bring of this for a couple of reasons is a letter of Hyeon, who's like, even if the Geniza had never been discovered in the late 19th century, this is still somebody we would have known about. This is like a very, famous, for those who know the inside baseball. It's always funny when people say like famous, but to whom? A famous Gaon of the 11th century, who all we had to go on were his legal opinions, his responsa. And the Geniza yielded some letters of his. And in this case, I like this letter because I had read it so many times before I realized what was going on. So if you're a medieval letter writer, the first thing you have to know is that you cannot mention anyone without putting a blessing after their name. Now, if you really, really hate their guts, you still put a blessing after their name, but it's a kind of underhanded one or like a curse or something like that. But you have to say something. So if you look carefully at the blessings in this letter, he's writing to thank a benefactor. I had a teacher at the Jewish Theological Seminary when I was in graduate school named Neil Danzig, who used to describe the letters of the Gaonim as Schnorbriefen, which is Yiddish for begging letters. So you expect these kind of glorious, legal pronouncements, and in fact what you get are fundraising letters. And this is one where he says, "Please thank on my behalf David ibn Babshad," who's probably a Karaite, by the way. "May God support him, since he has extended towards me every kindness, benefited me, and been loyal to me. Let him know of the esteem in which I hold his loyalty." So translation, tell him to send me more money. But when he puts in the blessing after his name, he puts it in Arabic script. And it's something that, again, I had read the letter so many times before I realized this was happening and before I realized how kind of momentous it was. There are a couple of different ways to read this. One is that the Gaonim were educated outside of the confines of the yeshiva, and if you were writing a good letter in Arabic, you would simply habitually write, "Ayyadahullah, may God preserve him," and that was how it came out. But another way to read it, which was pointed out to me by an undergraduate, is maybe this is actually how people were learning to write letters inside the yeshiva, too, and we simply don't know the answer, but either way, that's what was happening. So that's just to give you a glimpse of kind of the curtain lifts, and this is what's going on.
The letter in Judeo-Arabic?
Yeah, sorry, the letter is in Judeo-Arabic, and for those who haven't had the pleasure, Judeo-Arabic is Arabic written in Hebrew characters. So the kind of geographic mobility that Jews started to enjoy in the centuries following the Islamic conquests simply couldn't have been fathomable before. It was unfathomable in a number of ways. First of all, the proportion of Jews, especially male Jews who now traveled, the number of voyages that a Jew was likely to undertake over a single lifespan. So in other words, if you traveled once, you were probably going to travel more than once. The distances that a single person could traverse on a regular basis, and also the techniques that Jews used to remain networked even as they traveled, especially letters. So one thing that my research over the years has convinced me of is that this map of medieval Jews is good as far as it goes, but it actually doesn't go far enough. In fact, if you want to get a kind of if you take a snapshot of the geographic region that the documents actually cover, we're looking at a much, much broader expanse. By the 9th century, Jews had reached China. In the late 11th and 12th century, traders were making money hand over fist in the Indian Ocean trade, and Jews were among them. In the 9th and 13th century, we have evidence that there were Jews in the eastern Indian Ocean, including Sumatra. I'll get to that in a minute. And we know about this primarily because of the Geniza, but there are other caches of documents that contribute to our knowledge that I'll come to towards the end of the lecture. So first, let me just talk a little bit about the Cairo Geniza. It's a rapidly changing field, which I'm really happy to be able to say. Part of this is the advent of digital technology, and part of it is that there's now a critical mass of specialists in the field. So things are really moving, and they have been moving for 10, 15 years. So even this is a field you tend to follow. I might say some things that you haven't heard before. So the Cairo Geniza, the name comes from a Hebrew phrase, Beit Geniza, which is a burial chamber or a storage chamber, generally for worn out texts. Although that's covering over a much, much more complicated history to do with old Iranian languages, and biblical Hebrew. And in fact, again, because of this big sort of gap in coverage, we don't exactly understand how this particular practice developed. But by the time the Cairo Geniza starts developing, Jews are depositing their worn documents into a dedicated chamber in their synagogues. So the way this happened in Cairo's special for a number of reasons, but most of all because it's the largest and oldest Geniza to have survived. So when I say Cairo, first of all, this is a bit of a misnomer because in fact, the place where people actually lived in the 11th and 12th century was Fustat, which was the older residential core, whereas Cairo proper was a Palatine city that was walled off, and so you didn't get to hang out there unless you were part of government circles. The Fatimid dynasty arose in North Africa in 909, and they entered Egypt in 969. They had made several attempts to conquer Egypt, but they were finally successful in 969, and it was bloodless because Egypt was in administrative disarray when they came in. And they immediately set about building a number of buildings that still stand today. So if you go to Cairo today and you want to see some Fatimid buildings, you should ask to see Islamic Cairo. Whereas if you want to see Fustat, don't ask for Fustat because people will laugh at you. Ask for Coptic Cairo, called thus because there are lots of medieval Coptic churches that survive there. So the Fatimids arose in central North Africa, Ifriqiya, in 909. And if you watch the map carefully, it's about to turn more green than lavender as the Fatimids conquer Egypt, Syria, and part of the Arabian Peninsula, which essentially means that they're taking the biggest tax-yielding regions outside of Iraq for themselves and depriving the Abbasid Empire of lots and lots of revenue. The change was palpable at the time. There's a geographer from Palestine from the 10th century. He's writing about 985. And he himself actually says, Baghdad has been superseded until the day of judgment. Egypt's metropole has now become the greatest glory of the Muslims. So there's an idea that Baghdad's great, but that was then, this is now. Now Cairo is the important city. So this is the city of Fustat, and the yellow buildings here are Christian churches, the ones that survive. In the blue, you see the Ben Ezra Synagogue, and that's where the Cairo Geniza was kept. The way this looks on the ground is if you go down this alley and hang a left at the gentleman with the cane, if you hit the Coptic Museum, you've gone too far. What you're looking for is this. This is the Ben Ezra Synagogue as it was refurbished after 1991. It actually looks from this photo much larger than it is. If you go inside, it's a little jewel box of a synagogue, small enough, I would say, probably just about the size and volume of this room, that when I first went there, I had to totally revise my notions, either of the Jewish population of medieval Cairo or of how many people actually made it to synagogue on a regular basis, or possibly of how many synagogues there were, because it's a very, very small space. At the same time, the space that you'll see is a simulacrum. It's not actually the medieval synagogue. It was built on the site of the medieval synagogue, supposedly on the footprints. I mean, there are people who, in the 19th century, had seen the old building, and then they saw the new building that was built in the 1890s, and they were like, yes, yes, it's just the same, but do we really know? No. If you look at this photo, there's a mezzanine level, and on the left-hand side of the mezzanine is the women's gallery. And if you go on the left-hand side of the mezzanine all the way to the front wall of the synagogue, you'll see a little hole in the wall. And again, that hole in the wall is not actually historically accurate, because for much of the 19th century, the Geniza was accessible only via a hole in the roof. So it was a totally walled-off chamber that people were not accessing on a regular basis. What was going on in the Middle Ages, we don't actually know. Whether it was accessible via a hole in the wall or via a hole in the roof is not entirely clear. One of the advantages of being in Cairo, people think that the Geniza survived the way it did because of the dryness of Cairo. Cairo is actually not that dry. What Cairo has to its advantage, or to the advantage of manuscripts, is even humidity. So the humidity level will be about 45 degrees in the winter. It'll go up to about 60 in the early summer, and then it kind of falls gently back down to 45 degrees humidity, which turns out to be the perfect humidity level for preserving paper, parchment, and papyrus. But there's another factor as well. It's not just the climate. If anyone's ever been to Cairo, you know about the dust. So the dust of Cairo is a very particular kind of dust. I'm not talking now about what happens when there's a sandstorm. That's different. I'm talking about just the average everyday dust of Cairo, which it's like a thing. Like if you live in Cairo, you have to dust your bookshelves every day, even if you're keeping your windows closed. It sort of fills your sinuses and, with this kind of wonderful, heady cocktail of diesel fuel. If you've been there, you know just what I'm talking about. I find it completely addictive. But I didn't understand until I talked to a friend of mine there who's a historic preservationist, Nawal Hassan, who explained to me that the source of the dust is not the desert. The source of the dust is actually the Muqattam Massif, which is a limestone cliff that overlooks Cairo, and it's friable. So the dust is actually coming from there, and that means that it's limestone dust. And limestone, by definition, is 50% calcium carbonate, which is chalk, which turns out to be a fantastic substance for preserving paper, parchment, and ink. Again, something I didn't realize until I talked to a papermaker friend of mine who's like, if you really want to preserve this stuff, you should put chalk in it. I was like, oh, light bulb. So the dust turns out to have been very, very fortunate for the Geniza. The story of the Geniza discovery, I'm not going to get into now, but I do just want to flag the fact that it's a complex story, much more complex than anyone realized for most of the 20th century. So the ice started to break with this book, Sacred Trash, by Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole, who pointed out that there's a whole prehistory to the famous moment when Solomon Schechter from Cambridge emptied the chamber in 1897. And that prehistory is a very, very interesting and complicated one, and explains why the Geniza today is dispersed over more than 60 collections. But even that book didn't actually get to the bottom of it. Rebecca Jefferson, who used to work in the Geniza Research Unit at Cambridge University and is now at the University of Florida, is digging into the archives of people from the 19th century who were involved in collecting these manuscripts. And there are still many mysteries, but she's solved many of them. So watch this space for her book. This is an iconic picture of Solomon Schechter when he got home from Cambridge with about 200,000 Geniza fragments. And this is what they look like before conservation. So the point being here, this is still happening today. This is a photograph that I was sent by a paper conservator from the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2015 after they had begun conserving and encapsulating some of the fragments that had literally never been sorted or taken out of boxes. So no researcher had ever seen these. And as soon as she sent this to me, I got really excited because I was in the process of studying my favorite kind of document. This is going to sound so boring, which is the Fatimid tax receipt. I love tax receipts. And it turns out that is a Fatimid tax receipt right there. And I was like, please conserve these. So then she sent me the pictures of them conserved, and I realized how great it was that she had sent me the picture of the unconserved documents. So this is still going on. Every once in a while, like a shoebox will pop out of the closet of the grandson of an early 20th century Geniza researcher. This happened a few years ago to a friend of mine in London. So not everything is accounted for. But even the things that are accounted for, less than half of it has been identified, let alone deciphered. So what I'm going to tell you now are some provisional statistics, but this could all change depending on what happens with research in the next decade or two. So the vast majority of what we have from the Geniza dates from this period between 950 and 1250, about which we knew very, very little before the Geniza came to light. Although there are significant pockets of information from the 16th and the 19th centuries, which are finally beginning to get their due, by which I mean there are like 2 researchers now as opposed to 0 who are interested in the later Geniza material. The grand total is about 400,000 pages or fragments of pages, which is considerably more than you may have heard. This is only in part because of those shoeboxes that are coming out of the woodwork. This is also because there are computerized methods of counting what are called multi-fragments, which is tiny fragments that are bound 100 to the page. So those used to be counted as one, and now they're actually counted singly. About 90% are books. I put this in quotation marks because a book in the Middle Ages is many things. So a book is a text meant for posterity, written as it were on speakerphone in the sense that you don't know quite who's going to read it in the future, even if you've dedicated it to an individual. But physically, a book can take many forms. There's the codex, which is the book as we know it, and there are very few whole codices that survived in the Geniza because, generally speaking, what you were putting in there was old books. This is a fascinating codex because it's a copy of a biblical book that didn't make it into the Jewish canon. So it demonstrates that Jews were reading non-canonical literature in the Middle Ages, which nobody suspected. Nobody even knew that the Hebrew original of this particular text had survived because only the Christians had preserved the book. So we knew the Greek, but we didn't know the Hebrew. And in the end, dozens of fragments of the book of Ecclesiasticus have come to light from the Geniza, but only in 2018 did an article emerge trying to put together the actual codices from which these pages came. So that's the codex. Then the codex consists of smaller units, which codicologists, specialists in books, call quires. And a quire is a number of bifolio pages nested together. This is from a collection in St. Petersburg. It's a manuscript that Luke Yarborough, who's here, is working on together with a team of researchers, and it's a totally fascinating one-off text. It seems to be an administrative manual, like government administrative manual from late 11th century Palestine. So it's in the form of a quire, so 10 pages essentially. Here's another example of a quire. This is a liturgical text in Hebrew, the author of which we actually know, which is not so common. So that's the second form of the book. The third form of the book is the horizontal scroll, which is a much older form. That had been kind of the major form of the book in antiquity until the codex started to make inroads, especially among Christian books. And the story of how the codex finally made inroads among Jews is a fascinating one because for most of antiquity, Jews avoided writing anything in codex form and stuck to the scroll, probably because the codex was kind of smacked of Christianity, and Jews wanted to make their books look different from Christian books. But then what happened is that when the Muslims came along, they as a minority living among, in a huge sea of Christians, they wanted to make their holy book look like a serious holy book. So what are you going to do? You're going to make it look like a Christian book. So the earliest Quran manuscripts that we have are in codex form. And at that point, the Jews look at the codex and they say, okay, now it's kosher for us too. So the scroll, the horizontal scroll, became a kind of antiquated form for the Jews already by this period and was used mainly only for liturgical purposes, like reading Torah scrolls. Then there's the vertical scroll. So this is a very strange form of the book. It doesn't look like a book to us. It looks more like a document, but in fact, Jews routinely wrote literary texts in this long form. The one I'm showing you right now is about 3 meters long. And they particularly seem to have written texts for performances in the long rotulus form. That's what it looks like up close. Okay, so those are quote unquote books. Complicated issue, right? Summed up by one word, books. The other 10% of what's in the Geniza are documents. And again, the figure of 40,000 is quite a bit higher, certainly than what I was taught. So S.D. Goitein, who founded the field of documentary Geniza studies, used to estimate that there were between 10 and 15,000 documents. And that's what the second generation of documentary Geniza scholars, his students, including my teacher Mark Cohen, also used to go with by way of an estimate. But now that we have digital methods, by which I mean that people have actually made an attempt to photograph every single Geniza document, we have a much better sense of numbers. And so the current figure that I'm citing is 40,000, which sounds like insanely high if, like me, you were educated thinking about 10 to 15,000 documents. But in fact, the Princeton Geniza project, which I took over when I came to Princeton in 2015, now has nearly 30,000 records. So I think 40,000 is probably not an unreasonable estimate. I just want to point out here the great fat eunuch. This is real, like you can't make this stuff up, but what we do is we make an effort to have that document always be the first one in the database, so it's the first thing you see when you go to the Princeton Geniza Project website. This is cataloged by my friend Oded Zinger, who has a knack for finding the most hilarious Geniza documents. Okay, so those are the documents. The linguistic situation is relatively simple. The documents tend to be in Judeo-Arabic, again, Arabic and Hebrew characters, in Hebrew, occasionally in Aramaic, which is like fancy if you want to use old legal terminology, as well as Arabic script. So that's kind of what you can expect to find. Lots of Hebrew script, lots of Arabic script. But then, and here's an example of both together. So here's a Hebrew script document. This is a marriage contract. Even if you knew absolutely nothing about either Hebrew or about medieval documents, you could probably guess at what this was, because you see at the bottom a bunch of handwriting that doesn't look like it's written in the same hand as the rest of the document. It turns out that those are signatures, and this is a legal document with 11 signatories. These guys are actually a pretty calligraphic bunch, but one of the great things about signatures as historical evidence is that you can see kind of the varying states of semi-literacy that people had. Sometimes they could only write their names, they could only write them in something approximating square script, but they had never learned to write beyond that. This is an Arabic script document that was discovered by a graduate student in a seminar that I was teaching 2 years ago. It's a business letter in Arabic that mentions various Red Sea ports as well as India. So this is basically an Indian Ocean trade letter that had not yet been identified or noticed or discovered by any of the people who are actually working on Indian Ocean documents. And that's just to give you a sense. I had 6 graduate students in that seminar, and over the course of the semester, this came to light. Another couple of interesting things came to light, but the best one was when I had the students just go through like piles and piles of Arabic script documents to try to identify whatever they could. And then they would email me the night before the seminar and kind of give me the rundown, and then we'd come to class and we'd try to read 1 or 2 of them. And so one of them emails me the night before class, and he says, "Nothing that exciting this week. I found a petition to Saladin, who was the first Ayyubid Sultan," and it was so great because when you make these discoveries, you don't often know that you're even making a discovery, right? So he thought, oh, this is totally normal, a petition to Saladin. I said to him, there's only one other petition to Saladin that has survived on the planet Earth, and you've just discovered number 2. So the discoveries are still coming. And then there are curiosities. So this was discovered by Gideon Bohak at Tel Aviv University in 2008. And despite the best efforts of Indic linguists and philologists, nobody actually knows what language it's written in. I've given it to a couple of specialists who said, Indic dialectology is really, really difficult. This seems to be something resembling Southern Gujarati. So basically, we don't know what language it's written in. But one thing that we do know is that there are peppercorns in this text, which makes me really happy, because if it had been like a copy of some literary text that we have kind of, a dime a dozen, I would have been a sad panda. But it seems to be some kind of commodity-bearing document in a Sanskrit-derived script, which stands to reason because of all of the Jews in the Indian Ocean trade. So this must have made it back to Cairo somehow in a trader's personal archive. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about the Indian Ocean trade, because this is really where, for me, the penny dropped when I started to try to think in a kind of summary way about, okay, well, what actually has the Geniza taught us? We've known that there were something like 600, 700 documents that have survived documenting trade in the Western Indian Ocean, trade by Jews, but Jews had trading partners who weren't Jews as well. But it's not really until you kind of look into the documents that you understand the momentousness of this. So the trade routes, first of all, the Indian Ocean trade and the Mediterranean trade are connected. What's being traded in the Mediterranean, much of it actually comes from the Indian Ocean, which I hadn't realized until I really started looking at the stuff. And there you see Egypt at the kind of hinge between these two trades. Now, how you actually get to India, so it's kind of incredible that anybody managed to do this at all. The one thing that you needed to do was to studiously avoid the northern Red Sea, because the northern Red Sea has coral reefs and bad winds. And it was the most dangerous passage you could imagine. So instead, you would go up the Nile, and then you would go overland at Qus, and then you would set out sailing on the Red Sea at Qusair. You would sail south. Aden became a very, very important port along this trade, although it's not actually a very well-endowed natural harbor. But what the Adenese did was to provide services to boats that other harbors didn't provide. They kind of, they tried harder, like, I don't know, the HBSC of their day or something. And then eventually you'd go over by the Persian Gulf and to the western coast of India. But what it actually felt like to do that is another question. So this is a letter from a trader who's originally from Libya, from Tripoli in Libya, and he's writing to his brother back home in 1103. And he's describing what for him was an absolutely terrifying journey. And it was terrifying for him not because of storms, not because the ship foundered or anything like that, but because the methods of boat building in the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean were different. So in the Mediterranean, you'd have boats that were made with nails. And in the Indian Ocean, you had boats that were tied together with coconut coir ropes, which he found to be uniquely terrifying. So he says, then we left al-Maqla'in, which I still don't know where it is, and set sail in a ship that had in it not a single nail of iron, but rather was tied together with ropes. May God protect us with his shield. So he's just getting going. So now he describes the journey down the Red Sea, and he describes it in rhyme. I arrived in Adab, which is truly a city of tribulations, Adab. We arrived at a city called Sawakin, which is really a most frightening place, Akhad Amakin. Then we arrived at a city called Badia, the one that cuts, for it is just as the name says, the most bitter, frightening, miserable of places. Then we arrived at a city called Dahlak. The following adage is said about it, but you surpass them all. It is a ruinous land, Balad Muhlik. So he's clearly enjoying the storytelling here, but nonetheless, it gives you a sense of how kind of terrifyingly different this must have been for those who were used to the Mediterranean trade. These are the scholars who've done the lion's share of the work on the Indian Ocean trade. They largely focused on the philology, just trying to understand what the documents say, which itself is not for the faint of heart, but there's much, much more to be done in terms of historical contextualization. Goitein died in 1985. His student Mordechai Akiva Friedman took over the India Documents project from him. It took him 25 years to publish volumes 1 through 4. Volumes 5 through 7 are sitting in a filing cabinet in Princeton, New Jersey. Okay, so one of the things that I'm trying to do is bring in the scholars who will actually get this stuff out into the public. It's much likelier that they'll go online before they go between covers because I simply want them to be out there and available. So this is where we get the Eastern Indian Ocean. This was super surprising to me when I found it, and then I realized that I'd actually read these texts several times before I was able to locate them on a map and realize what was going on. This is a draft of a court record in the hand of Maimonides' son, Abraham Maimonides. This is from 1226. And the record says, we, the undersigned members of the court, assembled in a court session in Fustat on Tuesday. The dating systems are crazy, 1226 CE. Abu Sa'id al-Levi, son of the elder Abu al-Ma'ani al-Levi, the merchant known as Dajaji, testified to us that Abu al-Fadl ibn Mukhtar al-Iskandari, known as Ibn something, died in Kala, in the lands of something or other. So we know that that's actually Malaysia. He checked and certified this when he went to Al-Mahabar, which is the Malabar coast in India. And when he deposited his testimony in our presence, we wrote it down for it to be a title of right and proof. Okay, so basically a Jew dies in the Eastern Indian Ocean in 1226. Is this significant? So it turns out he's not the only one. So this is the port of Fansur, which is where a lot of camphor came out of in this period. And this is also a document to do with Abraham Maimonides from a few years earlier. So the question here has to do with what happened to the wives of these India traders who were left behind if they disappeared, right? There's a problem in Jewish law. If you don't have a proper divorce document, you can't remarry. Meaning if your husband disappears, and there's no proof of his death and he hasn't left you a conditional divorce document, then you can never remarry. So a man traveled to the lands of India and he spent 15 years there. Not a single letter has arrived from him. His wife works, eats, and provides for 2 children. He has a mother, and when he went to India, we think he also left her behind. A Jewish man was sent from Aden to close a deal. I met him and asked him to tell me the news regarding the man who was missing, presumably. He told me, we heard in Aden from those docked in the bay that he died in Fansur, at which point the government there took his possessions. Instruct us, our teacher, is this testimony sufficient to permit the wife's remarriage? And alas, the answer is no, in fact, that this counts as hearsay. It doesn't count as a properly witnessed fact, and therefore she can't remarry. So this is a text that Goitein discovered half of it. He discovered the right half. And he published it with a speculative reconstruction of what the left half might have said, which when the left half was later located, turned out to be like 80% correct, which was kind of mind-blowing. I had an undergraduate student who worked on these 2 documents last year who pointed out to me that actually when you look at the way Jewish law was shaped, you have to remember that it's not just the rabbis who are shaping it. It's also the wives of the husbands who are missing like thousands and thousands of kilometers away. You have to have a much, much kind of bigger vision of what the Jewish community is than just the organized Jewish community that you can actually see through the documents that we know best. So this was kind of like, I was listening to him give a presentation on class and I said, I gotta totally revise my vision here. Okay, so that's just to give you a sense of how this has all changed. And to give you a sense as well of the geographic breadth. But there's also quite a bit of depth. There is depth on the daily lives of congregations and congregants. We know from Eve Krakowski's book, I understand she spoke here a couple of years ago, there was more divorce, more extramarital sex, more quasi-independent women, less literacy, less piety, more internecine strife, which of course I love. I love to write about Jews who fight with other Jews. Krakowski also points out that there's only a minority of children who are likely to live with a single set of adults in a single household over their lifetimes. So very flexible living arrangements. And if you look at archaeological excavations from medieval Cairo, you can actually see how this works because there's not a lot of mobile furniture. The seating arrangements are built into the walls. People didn't have a lot of stuff, and people had extended families to whom they passed back and forth on a regular basis. The implications of that for the transmission of Jewish tradition in an age when Judaism was learned not from books, but mimetically, from imitating the grown-ups around you, are also momentous. Krakowski explores the idea of lived customs versus technical legal norms. What she means by that is that on the one hand, when you look at how Jews were actually living, it's very similar to how Muslims were practicing marriage and divorce arrangements. At the same time, the rabbinic technical norms were very different from Islamic law. So how are they squaring these two? And that's what her book is about. So that's just one area of depth that's opened up recently, is gender and the family. There's quite a bit more Arabic script than we realized, including Jews who are having their cases against other Jews tried in Qadi courts. And there's a lot more takeout food than I would have anticipated. So just as Cairo today is like the global center of takeout food, so too in the Middle Ages, it was much, much more likely that you were getting your food hot from the market in a food carrier than cooking it at home, because the last place you wanted a fire was in your house. This is a strange little text. It seems to be some kind of a shopping list with a number of foods, including at the end a fat hen. Again, you can't make this stuff up. And what's written on the other side is a section from the Babylonian Talmud to do with the kosher slaughtering of animals. So you can try to reconstruct for yourself where this little slip of paper might have come from. Somebody's basket in the marketplace, or perhaps a meat stall or something like that. This was, I don't know, the guy who was overseeing the butchery dropped it or something like that. And finally, there's quite a bit more magic than we realized. So this is a set of amulets against scorpions, hence the drawings of scorpions, that the amulet writer wrote in multiple, and apparently he only managed to sell just a few of his amulets, and the rest of them survived together. But these would have been cut apart into pieces and kept rolled up in an amulet holder around the neck. So all of this has kind of emerged in the last 2 or 3 years, and this is typical of the way research goes in this field. It proceeds slowly and pointillistically. You get a kind of pinprick of light here, a pinprick of light there, and until you can actually make a connection between them, sometimes takes a long time. On top of that, the manuscripts are fragmentary. They're housed in 60 collections on 4 continents, and the skills needed to make sense of them are specialized. But that said, digital technology has changed everything. So we have this kind of illusion in the humanities that we're like in our monk cells working in solitude, but the possibilities of collaboration that digital technologies have opened up, I think, have forced us to admit that in fact what we do is much more similar to what the scientists do when they work in labs together. It's also enabled us to go back to images constantly and to be looking at the texts. I wrote my entire dissertation based on printed texts, based on Geniza texts that had been edited by somebody else, meaning printed text without looking at the originals. That's unthinkable today. You learn so much just by looking at the text. And what that means, the corollary of that, is that our eyes have improved. We actually see more on these texts than we were seeing a generation ago. I don't think that's entirely because we're looking at more Geniza fragments. I think that might also be because of Instagram, but if it's a good thing, that's fine. Okay, so that's the kind of the Jewish history side. More briefly, I want to give you a glimpse of what's changed in Middle Eastern history, and then I'll bring it all home. So for the medieval Middle East, if all we had to go on were the Hebrew texts of the Cairo Geniza, we would actually have a surprising amount of information about Christians and Muslims. But that information would be skewed in one significant respect. It would be about Christians and Muslims as seen by Jews, by their trade partners, by their neighbors, by their patrons and clients. Fortunately, there are Arabic script texts aplenty, but these have received much, much less attention than the Hebrew script texts have. There are legal deeds, and not just scattered legal deeds, but hundreds of them. They're not easy to read, but luckily, being legal deeds, in many cases, they're formulaic, so you can get the hang of it pretty quickly. There are trade letters, in which case we have no way of knowing whether their authors are Jews, Christians, or Muslims, because Jews also wrote trade letters in Arabic script. And there are literary works aplenty, in which case, as well, we have no idea what the religion of the scribe would have been, not even if the text is the Quran, because we have lots of evidence that Jews and Christians copied the Quran on a regular basis. The material text can also teach us something. So this is a fragment of the epistle of the so-called Brethren of Purity, the Ikhwan as-Safa, which is a work written in southern Iraq in the 10th century in many, many volumes. It's a fascinating kind of omnipedia by a group of thinkers who were absolutely committed to classical ideals, Pythagorean ideals in geometry, in music, and in calligraphy. And they were responsible for a revolution in Arabic script. I have like a whole chapter on this in my book because I found this so fascinating. And this is a copy of their epistle on music written in precisely the script that they actually prescribe writing in. So this is like a typical second half of the 10th century southern Iraqi script, and it survived in the Geniza. So was this very fragment the vehicle for the transmission of the Ikhwan as-Safa from Iraq to Egypt? We don't know, but it's only by actually understanding the material text that we can begin to piece bigger stories together. Then we have texts that were reused by Jews. So let me just back up one step. If the Geniza was a repository for worn Hebrew script texts, why did non-Hebrew script texts survive in the Geniza? So I'm not going to give you every possible answer to that question because that would take me 643 pages. But I will say that in some cases, these texts survived in the Geniza simply because they were reused by Jews. In other cases, Jews would have read them or used them as literary models. So why is this so fascinating to me? Because here we get into the territory of Arjuna Padurai, The Social Life of Things, the most influential introduction ever written to an edited volume. The argument of which is that we can learn a lot about an object by tracing not just its production, but also its circulation and exchange. And on that level, there was one class of document that really intrigued me, which was documents that were produced by state officials, because these were documents that changed hands. And I thought that if I tried to trace all the hands through which these documents passed, I could learn not only about the Fatimid state, but also about how people related to the Fatimid state. So there are decrees. These are Fatimid state decrees that have been reused for Hebrew script texts. All of these come from the 1130s. There are many, many, many decree fragments. Most of the decree fragments that I found were actually sliced in half vertically before they were then sent out, presumably onto the used paper market, which is how Jews got their hands on them. But there were many other pathways by which Jews could get their hands on government documents. These are simply the most recognizable because they have these gigantic calligraphic lines with enormous line spacing. My colleague Tamar Alethi refers to this as the sovereign privilege of waste. Like, we're the caliphs, we can write as large as we want to. There are petitions. Again, so many that it would be possible to write a whole book just about the petition and response procedure based on Geniza documents. There are fiscal receipts. These are my beloved tax receipts. They're really, really hard to read. If you are fluent in Arabic and you want like a real challenge, try your hand at one of these. Again, luckily they mostly say the same thing, so if you can read one, you can read mostly all of them. And then there are state memoranda. So in this case, we have a memorandum in 5 different hands. The bottom section had been published by S.M. Stern and Jeffrey Kahn before me. They didn't realize that there were another 2, actually now 3 fragments that connected with these, so they weren't able to see that these were multiple hands. But if you think about the fact that there are 5 state officials writing on a single piece of paper, you immediately get a sense of the complex procedures that the government was developing as a kind of administrative habit. So the quotation that I brought to you from Michael Chamberlain about how there were no documents and these were autocratic decisions, you look at the documents themselves and you understand, no, there was a bureaucracy, there were procedures, and there were kind of predictable habits of documentation. It wasn't just the Middle East historians that I had to contend with when I wanted to talk about the state documents. It was also the Geniza historians themselves. So Goitein had kind of left the state out of his purview. One of the things he said about the Fatimids is that they excelled in laissez-faire. And then he went on to say, out of indolence, it seems, rather than conviction. So I've just shown you a lot of documentation that, to my mind, does not really smack of indolence. The far-reaching degree of autonomy enjoyed by the Jews and, of course, the Christians during their rule has a very simple explanation. Their Muslim subjects, too, were left mostly to their own devices. So this was kind of the image of the state in Geniza studies, because basically nobody had actually looked at the documentation that the state had produced. Now, Goitein thought that that the Fatimid state was weak, and he wasn't wrong about that. The Fatimid state was weak compared to modern states, but all pre-industrial states were weak compared to modern states. If you'd like to be disabused about what states were and weren't in the pre-modern period, this is the book to read, Patricia Crona's Pre-Industrial Societies. And if you don't feel like reading a whole book, just look at this chart. Consider the demographics. This is global population. So the population of the world in the period that I study was roughly the population of the US today, possibly the US and Canada. Or to put it another way, it was equivalent to the current population of Egypt and Brazil combined, right? That's the whole planet Earth. So manpower is thin on the ground, and that's going to yield a very different kind of state of administration than what we might unconsciously have in our minds based on 20th and 21st century states. But just because states were weak doesn't mean that they were non-existent or that they didn't rely on documentation, let alone in a region that had invented pretty much simultaneously both statecraft and writing. There was one other reason why all of the state documentation had been ignored, and that was that it's not very easy to read. So in the 1906 Bodleian Catalogue of Geniza manuscripts, every time there was a Fatimid state document, it was cataloged the same way, scribbling in Arabic characters. Okay, so you might say, well, this is 1906, we know better now. It turns out we don't know better now. The Bodleian online catalog still has this cataloged as illegible, when in fact it's a Fatimid fiscal document with some pretty fancy titles from about 1034. The UPenn Geniza collection cataloged this as scribbling in Arabic characters. It's just hilarious to me how the word scribbling keeps coming back. It's true that these scribes didn't like to lift the pen, but they were writing for each other, not for us. Okay, so there's a state with a complex system of documentation. Little did I know when I set out to understand the state documentation in the Geniza that there was enough material to try to reconstruct the state on its own terms, both as the Jews might have seen it and as they never could have seen it. So to kind of like put that into a nutshell, I have a colleague who finished her PhD at Princeton 3 years ago, is now in Vienna, who wrote on the Roman archiving system in Egypt based on papyri. And the Romans were like these totally ambitious archivists where they wanted everything in triplicate. And she has this fantastic papyrus that she quotes where the archivist comes into the Arsinoite Nome in the year 1 something or other and sees this huge heap of papyri with like mice nibbling away at it and says, oh my God, what am I gonna do with this? Like I've just inherited a total mess. And writes to his superiors and says, this is the current state of the archive, what would you like us to do? The Fatimids seem to have taken a different approach. They did not want everything in triplicate. They wanted everything in one copy in the central archives in Cairo, and the rest they simply jettisoned. So there was a constant pruning going on, which any archivist will tell you is necessary to archiving. If archives are there not just to store, but also to allow you to retrieve what you're looking for, they need to be organized, and to be organized, they need to be pruned. And it's to the pruning that we owe this kind of inverted mirror of the Fatimid archive that I have been digging up from the Geniza. Okay, last point. So how exceptional is all this? Is the Geniza simply a one-off and we'll never be able to do anything like this again? It turns out that it's not. There are actually other Genizas from the medieval Middle East, even if they're not called that. In Damascus, in the Umayyad Mosque, a structure in the courtyard called various things, but called, among other things, the Qubbat al-Khazna, the Dome of the Treasury, preserved about 200,000 fragments of texts in an array of languages that are suspiciously parallel to what you find in the Geniza. So Arabic, Syriac, Aramaic, Hebrew, as well as Greek, Latin, Coptic, and Old French, because after all, there was a crusade going on. So these are 200,000 medieval texts, almost all of which are in Istanbul now, and hardly any of which have been published. Another Umayyad mosque, the great Mosque of Sana'a in Yemen, preserved, kind of immured between the ceiling and the roof of the building, the oldest Quran manuscripts that we have. And they were simply sitting there, and it wasn't until the building was reconstructed in the 1970s that these were discovered. So this is the manuscript known as Sana'a 1. Behnam Sadeghi, who was here at UCLA, worked on this because it's a palimpsest. So the upper text is Quran, and the lower text is also Quran, and the lower text dates to before 669 CE. So it's the earliest evidence of the Quran that we have in physical form. So both the Damascus and the Sana'a caches raise the possibility that Muslims accorded similar treatment to worn sacred texts as Jews did, i.e. don't destroy it, but also protect it from future destruction. So there's a kind of sacred limbo. And the recurrent theme of having this immured, whether it's between the ceiling and the roof or between walls, is a fascinating one. So, as Mark Cohen argued in an article about 15 years ago, the custom of Geniza was not exclusively a Jewish one. And I agree with him that it was a kind of region-wide custom that wasn't necessarily due to any Jewish taboo or prohibition on destroying Hebrew script. I think there was a much wider prohibition on destroying text. But not only that, it's a custom that actually reaches well beyond the Middle East. This is a map of the Taklamakan Desert and the so-called Silk routes. And I don't know if you can see from where you're sitting, but there are these tiny yellow boxes. Each of those yellow boxes is a Geniza. So like we have our lovely Cairo Geniza, they have 40 Genizas. And there too, the practices are suspiciously parallel. So here at the eastern end of the Silk routes in Dunhuang, there's a story that, just like the story of the Geniza, begins around 1900 when a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu fled violence in his home region and came to the isolated town of Dunhuang. And I just want to give a shout out to my colleague Xin Wen, who, this is a story that's been told many times in Chinese and not many times in English, and Xin Wen tells it particularly well in his book In Progress, so I'm indebted to him for some of this information. So Wang appointed himself the caretaker of a series of caves known as the Grottos of Unparalleled Height, Mogao-ku, which housed Buddhist statues and murals dating from the 4th to the 14th century, so exactly a parallel time period to what we're talking about. So one night in 1900, the story goes, this Taoist monk saw a flickering of light in one of the cave walls, so he started just kind of digging at it. And eventually he tunneled through, and what he found was a small hidden chamber, about 3 meters by 5 meters, that had been sealed in the early 11th century and lay undisturbed for nearly 900 years. It contained 60,000 manuscripts. Most of them were Buddhist texts, plus around 3,000 documentary sources, about 5% of the total. The languages that he found there was a staggering array of languages, some of which have not yet been deciphered. Indo-European languages galore, Turkic, Mongolian, and Sino-Tibetan languages, as well as some Syriac and Hebrew. What ensues should sound familiar to those of us who know about the Geniza. Manuscript hunters made piecemeal acquisitions. Eventually, the collection was dispersed. It's now housed at the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and the National Library of China in Beijing, with smaller collections in St. Petersburg, Osaka, Taipei, and Princeton. So this is a kind of sacred limbo that's remarkably parallel to the other caches that I showed you. Not only that, you have evidence for the reuse of state documents for religious texts. So this is a decree from the ruler of Dunhuang giving permission for the 10-year-old daughter of an official to enter a monastery. The date seems to be in the early 10th century. And you can see the imprints from the ruler's seal in red there. And the back contains a Buddhist text, a Dharani, which is like the essence of a sutra that's generally used for meditative or prayer purposes. Likewise, the state documents that I saw, almost all of them are reused for Jewish liturgical texts. Okay, so what does it all mean? What can this wider array of sacrosanct wastebins, a phrase I've stolen from Amitav Ghosh, tell us that we didn't know before? First of all, written objects and cultures of the handmade. Was it the sanctity of the texts that led to their preservation in limbo, or a more generalized pre-modern reluctance to discard anything? Why are we surprised in the face of medieval people's habitual repurposing so that we feel that we have to explain it as an act of piety? This was a culture of the handmade in which everything was reused, in which things fashioned by human hands, including texts, were never casually destroyed, but passed from hand to hand and from use to use. An average person owned very few garments over a lifetime, and when the cloth could no longer be repaired, it was transformed into paper. And when what was written on the paper no longer mattered, you wrote something else on it. And when you could no longer write anything else on it, it went into the limbo of a Geniza. So what happens when we consider Asia as a continent not of static, disconnected, and mostly defunct civilizations, but of medieval documents, travelers, and traders, of the circulation of written artifacts, of their survival at the seams between the desert and the sown, and of the view that those documents can give us of extraordinary human mobility in pursuit of knowledge, of stable employment, of profit, and of prestige, of the capacity of human beings to solve logistical problems before the industrial age. We should take all these lessons seriously because if there's one thing the Cairo Geniza has taught us, it's that medieval Jews were not so very different from the Muslims, Christians, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, and Hindus among whom they lived and worked. A Jewish householder from Jerusalem thought nothing of traveling to Baghdad to study with a revered scholar. A trader from Tripoli in Libya undertook journeys to Aden despite the terror of nailless boats. A Hebrew poet from Cordoba received commissions from patrons in Cairo and Kairouan. And a Jew's disappearance in Sumatra or Malaysia and his wife's need for clarity occasioned the testimony of traders in Aden and the writing of rabbinic responsa in Cairo. It's not so different from the world we see in the Tarim Basin finds, but they haven't yet been connected with the Geniza finds, mostly because of the linguistic complexities. The linguistic complexities of the medieval imperial world, which make outsized demands on our modern nationalist brains, impoverished by a lack of polyglottism. Connecting these disparate worlds can shed light not just on Jewish history, but on global history more broadly. It's just a question of digging through the documents. Thank you.